Hey, this is lecture 2, the first of 2 lectures introducing the cognitive behavioral model. And this lecture is going to focus on some of the dominant strains of scientific research in the field of clinical psychology and that underlie the cognitive behavioral model. So the 3 strains of psychological science that we're going to talk about today are behaviorism, neuroanatomy. We're just going to touch on some relevant brain areas, structures, and neurotransmitters. And then lastly, a quick introduction to Darwinian medicine and psychopathology. Okay, so at the end of the last lecture, I started talking about behaviorism, or I introduced behaviorism as a historical strain in psychological science and psychological thinking. And in the last lecture, I kind of framed it as a unidimensional model. That's kind of misrepresenting it because behaviorism is very consistent with a biological understanding of the human brain. In fact, most of the research that supports behaviorist theories has been done on animals. So behaviorism doesn't really take into account necessarily at all people's cognitive, conscious, sentient experience. It really focuses on the brain structures that support and underlie learning and memory. So in behaviorism, there are 3 kind of broad types of learning. The first, and the one that might be the most kind of familiar as a psychological concept, is associative learning, which is also called Pavlovian conditioning. Basically, this is kind of 2 things. One, organisms are really good at learning when 2 events co-occur, if one or more of those events is salient to the organism. And salient just means important to them for some survival reason related to food, survival, reproduction. So any stimulus that is important because it has value to their survival or their ability to reproduce. Food is kind of the classic example. So these salient stimuli, which are called unconditioned stimuli, naturally provoke an emotional response. In the case of food, it creates a positive emotional response in the dog. Objectively, in Pavlov's experiments, well, actually, in Pavlov's original experiments, he measured this objectively by inserting tubes into the stomachs of dogs and measuring their gastric acid output. But the more palatable method that he also used was measuring their salivation. So in response to a salient unconditioned stimulus like food, dogs have a natural unconditioned response. They salivate, they get happy, they wag their tails, they seem excited. Another type of stimulus is known as a conditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that has no emotional valence on its own until it has been repeatedly paired with a conditioned stimulus. So any stimulus that co-occurs consistently with a stimulus that has emotional value to an animal takes on that same emotional value over time after repeated pairings. So the other meaning of Pavlovian conditioning or associative learning is developing an emotional response to a stimulus that used to be neutral. So in Pavlov's famous experiments, he had a bunch of dogs, and every time he fed them, he blew a whistle, rang a bell, he made a specific noise that was always paired with food. This noise signaled that food was about to come. He would ring the bell or blow the whistle and then feed the dogs. The first time the dogs ever heard the whistle, they didn't have any reaction to it, but of course they had a reaction to the food. Over time, after the whistle and the food were repeatedly presented together, every single time the dogs heard the whistle, they got fed immediately after. Eventually, just hearing the whistle was enough to make the dogs excited, start wagging their tails, start drooling, start having an emotional and physiological reaction related to food. But they weren't reacting to food, they were actually reacting to the whistle. They did this even in trials where the whistle was presented by itself and wasn't immediately followed with food. So that is associative learning. Associative learning is when something that used to have no meaning becomes meaningful to you because it consistently co-occurs with something else that is meaningful. And in a behavioral animal cognition sense, that meaning is referred to as emotional valence. So a stimulus that had no emotional valence before, like a whistle, takes on emotional valence. It takes on the same emotional response, the unconditioned response, that an organism has to the unconditioned stimulus. When the response is happening in response to a conditioned stimulus, it's called a conditioned response. So another example of associative learning that might be really familiar to you is humans' really incredible ability to form negative associations to the tastes of foods that are paired with nausea and vomiting. So maybe some of you have had this experience where you drank a little bit too much of a specific type of alcohol or a specific cocktail, threw up, and were never able to look at that drink again. Every time you had it, you had a conditioned aversive response. In real life, like what you actually might experience if you have a conditioned association, you can't look at tequila, you can't smell or taste tequila without feeling like you're going to throw up again, because tequila has now been paired with nausea and vomiting for you. So tequila is an unconditioned stimulus that provokes a conditioned response of nausea and vomiting, even though there's no reason, no physiological illness or reason why you would be nauseous. It's a conditioned response. In the case of food that's been paired with nausea and vomiting, this is actually called a conditioned taste aversion. Another kind of learning, actually a simpler form of learning that has been observed in much simpler organisms than either other type of learning, is habituation. This is also known as non-associative learning because habituation is learning about a single stimulus. Basically what habituation is after a stimulus is repeatedly presented over and over and over to an organism with no change in the way that it's presented, so no change in intensity, no change in valence, and never paired with anything else that's more meaningful to the organism, organisms will stop having a response to it. Basically, this is just kind of common sense if you were thinking about how you would design an organism. If a stimulus in the environment isn't meaningful, if it's not conveying any information about the environment, because it's repetitive, it doesn't change, it doesn't increase, it's not paired with anything else, it makes sense to ignore it and direct your cognitive neural resources towards stimuli that might be more meaningful. In practice, when you've experienced habituation, it's probably been like getting used to something or tuning something out. So for example, if you have tags in your clothes, or actually if you're wearing clothes at all, you probably weren't thinking about how the clothes felt on your body. You weren't really experiencing the contact between fabric and your skin. Now that I'm talking about it and you're thinking about it, you might be noticing that for the first time since you put on your clothes this morning. The nervous system, the human brain, is really good at tuning out irrelevant stimuli. And that is, at its most basic, what habituation is. The third kind of learning is operant conditioning. In other words, training. This is when you reinforce a behavior with either a positive or a negative consequence. If you want an organism, from a hamster to a human, to do something less, you punish it. You either engage in a positive punishment where you add something new that is aversive because it's punishment, or you punish the organism by taking away something that's pleasurable. This is also known as a negative punishment. If you want the organism to increase its behavior, you reward the behavior either positively by giving it something that it likes, or negatively by taking away something that it doesn't like. An example of this would be if you were trying to train your dog to do a trick, you would reward the dog probably with food every time it did the behavior that you want it to do in response to the command that you want to use to get it to do that trick. So that's another important thing. There needs to be typically a signal in the environment that doing the behavior under these circumstances will result in the reward. When you train a dog to sit, you're training the dog to sit when it hears the word sit. You're not teaching it to expect that anytime it sits down, it's going to get a reward. So typically operant conditioning goes hand in hand with classical conditioning, because the classical conditioning involved in this is associating the word sit with the knowledge that sitting, when I hear this word, means I'll get a treat. So sit, which doesn't mean anything to a dog because it doesn't have language, takes on a meaning of this is a signal that if I do this behavior, I'll be rewarded. One of the most common kinds of negative reinforcement that we'll talk about in this class is avoidance. When there's a situation that you really don't like and you do something that helps you escape that situation, that behavior is negatively reinforced. So, for example, someone who's a little bit socially anxious and doesn't really like being at parties where they don't know very many people reduces their anxiety by drinking a little alcohol. Alcohol lowers anxiety. Anxiety doesn't feel good, so the behavior of drinking is negatively reinforced by the removal of anxiety. Okay, so this is the office video that I tried to show you. NBC has taken it down, but I found another version. This is an example of conditioning and learning. Oops. Thanks to Tony, Angie, Tori, and
I have to
Ali.
reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? Dwight, want an Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
Okay, so that video was an example of a type of learning. What kind of learning was it? So there was associative learning happening in this clip. That's what it was titled, classical conditioning. In this case, the sound that the computer made is the conditioned stimulus. That computer sound doesn't, well, it means something to us because it means something related to computers. We know that it means that the computer is turning on or off, but it took on a new meaning because it was repeatedly paired with Jim giving Dwight an Altoid. So over time, as the computer sound was repeatedly paired with the Altoid, Dwight kind of came to expect that anytime he heard that computer sound, it would be followed by an Altoid. So in this example, the conditioned response, the response that Dwight has to the computer sound, which he used to only have in response to the Altoid itself, is probably something like salivation, what's known as defensive salivation, which happens when your body knows that you're about to eat something. And he experiences that and perceives it as a bad taste in his mouth. So that's the conditioned response in the associative learning happening here. There is also operant conditioning happening here because, of course, Dwight doesn't associate every computer sound with Altoids. He only associates it with this specific context when he's sitting at his desk and he's sitting across from Jim. He also has learned that reaching out in the presence of the computer sound will be rewarded with an Altoid. So he'll just reach out and Jim will put an Altoid in his hand. So in the clip, you see that he kind of reaches out without even really thinking about it. That's a behavior. So a behavior is anything that reinforces a behavior and causes an organism to engage in that behavior, either more or less, is operant conditioning. So both operant and classical conditioning were happening in that clip. Okay, so that was a pretty quick introduction to behaviorism. We're going to talk about it a ton during this class when we actually get into the disorders. But broadly, behaviorism as a discipline of psychology, I wouldn't say that it's really a standalone discipline anymore. It's basically similar to evolution. It's a theory in the sense that there's a ton of scientific evidence supporting that this is how the world works. But behaviorism explains thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as learned, either because of punishment and reward. And typically when we talk about punishment and reward for an organism in its natural environment, nobody's actually intentionally trying to shape an organism's behavior. That behavior is being shaped by the environment. In the case of humans, that behavior might be being shaped by the social environment, natural punishments and rewards. Or people can learn thoughts, emotions, and behaviors through incidental pairings with naturally meaningful stimuli and irrelevant, meaningless stimuli that take on the valence, the value of those naturally meaningful stimuli and become conditioned stimuli. So, like I said at the beginning of this, behaviorism is very consistent with the biological understanding of thought, emotion, and behavior. And in fact, neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and behaviorists study in the physical brain the neural structures and neural processes that actually support the acquisition of this learning. As well as, of course, behaviorism is based on the premise that emotions are really just physiological responses that have a biological basis in the brain and body. Behaviorism is also very consistent with evolutionary psychology, which is the theory that most behaviors that humans engage in that are universal to our species evolved because they were helpful to survival or reproduction at some point in our history. Behaviorism is very consistent with this idea because, of course, the ability to learn from our environment and change our behavior in response to contingencies in the environment is obviously going to be very beneficial for individual and species survival. So we can definitely trace this ability, the ability to monitor the environment, respond to the environment, and modify our own responses in response to feedback from the environment. We can trace that back to a very early ancestor that humans share with most other living organisms. Okay, So now we're going to touch on just some very bare bones basics of neuroanatomy and a little bit of physiology. So the basic premise of this part of the lecture is that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors do have a biological basis. A biological understanding of psychopathology was also presented in the last lecture as kind of a unidimensional, maybe like somewhat narrow model of understanding psychology. But really, it's only narrow right now because we don't have the tools, we don't have the resolution to actually examine the brain in the detail that we would need to actually see these processes happening in the brain, but they are happening in the brain. And our conscious experience is mediated by physical processes happening in the brain and nervous system. When we talk about the nervous system, what we're actually talking about is a collection of cells and cell fibers, which are also called axons, that exist throughout the body. This collection of cells is responsible for all of our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Within the nervous system, so between these groups of cells, communication happens through neurotransmitters, which is how neurons communicate with each other, and action potentials, which is how neurons communicate within themselves. Okay, so a neuron, also called a nerve, is a nervous system cell that communicates with other neurons via chemical signals. These chemical signals are in the form of neurotransmitters. What neurotransmitters actually are is little clumps of protein that have a specific shape, and that shape fits into a receptor like a lock into a key. So all neurons have dendrites, which is where they produce receptors, and they have axons, which is where they produce neurotransmitter. So when a presynaptic cell, when a presynaptic cell signals to our neuron here, the neuron that we're focusing on, the presynaptic cell is the cell that communicates to our neuron via neurotransmitters released into the synapse, which is the space between neurons. So that presynaptic cell releases its neurotransmitters into the synapse. They float around in the fluid that exists between neurons until they hit a receptor. If that neurotransmitter is the right shape to fit into the receptor, it binds to the receptor. And when neurotransmitters bind to their receptor, they create changes in the membrane of the cell. They change its electrical permeability and allow the cell to become depolarized. So it allows the charge of the cell to return closer to a neutral charge. When the cell becomes sufficiently depolarized, it releases an electrical signal from the cell body down the axon, the shaft of the neuron. That electrical signal travels all the way down until it reaches the axons at the opposite end of the neuron from the dendrites. When it reaches the axon, the electrical signal triggers the release of the neurotransmitters produced by that neuron into the postsynaptic space. So this cell over here communicates with this cell here via our main neuron that we're focusing on. That's a very quick and dirty view of how cells communicate within the nervous system. The important thing to remember is that neurotransmitters are the language of communication between neurons. They're produced by our cells, by our bodies. Each individual neuron produces its own set of neurotransmitters, and that influences what kinds of messages it can communicate, what other neurons it can communicate with. We can also produce what's known as endogenous neurotransmitters, or neurotransmitters that are not produced by the human body, but things that are shaped enough like neurotransmitters that they can interact with the receptors that our cells produce. And there are tons of examples of this, including basically any mind-altering substance that you can consume. So alcohol binds to the same receptor as the neurotransmitter GABA. Sorry, I'm realizing that I have a slide on neurotransmitters, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay, so nerves are the cells that make up our nervous system. They communicate with each other through neurotransmitters. The nervous system has two primary divisions, and then within one of the divisions, lots of subdivisions. I'm going to emphasize which one is the most relevant in a second. Well, it's hard to say that it's the most relevant, but it's the one that we'll talk about the most in the context of psychopathology. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And you might think that that's like the most important part. That's like all there is to the nervous system, because that's definitely what most people visualize when they think about where our cognitive and physiological functions are controlled. They might not even think about the spinal column. They just think about the brain. But There are nervous system cells throughout our body, not just enclosed within our skull and our spinal column. And this is the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is the way that our brain communicates with and controls our body. There's two branches of the peripheral nervous system. The first is the autonomic, well, not the first, but the one I'm going to talk about first is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls functions that we don't control with our conscious brains. It controls and regulates what's known as self-regulated actions in our bodies. So for example, as we're all sitting here giving or listening to this lecture, our intestines are consistently having muscle contractions that move food through our digestive system. We don't have to do that on purpose. And in fact, we can't control it at all. If we wanted to stop it, we couldn't with our conscious brains because it's controlled by our autonomic nervous system. One way of remembering this that could be helpful is that autonomic kind of sounds like automatic. These are functions that we don't have to do anything about. They just happen in the background. The autonomic nervous system has two main branches, and these branches just refer to what biological functions that branch helps to perform and control. The sympathetic nervous system is the part of our autonomic nervous system that controls functions related to arousal and stress. The parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is the branch that controls what's known as our resting state functions. So when we're not particularly stressed, when we're not aroused, when we're just kind of existing, the parasympathetic nervous system is in control. When we're stressed, when we're anxious, when we're putting forth any kind of effort, when we're in an unsafe environment, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Okay. Oops. Well, okay. So the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. The other branch of our nervous system, a lot of it is conscious and voluntary. So the somatic nervous system controls incoming sensory information. So the part of our nervous system that interacts with the world around us and hears, feels, touches, smells, and tastes things outside the body and communicates about that information into the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system is also how the brain controls our conscious behaviors. So this is the part of the nervous system that is directing the muscles in my mouth and tongue to talk. It's directing the muscles in my hands to gesticulate, probably too much. Skeletal muscles are any muscles that we have conscious somatic control over. The muscles that are regulated by the autonomic nervous system are known as smooth muscles. And these are the muscles in like our digestive system and our heart, muscles whose actions we can't control consciously. Okay, so the important thing about this slide is that the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems control the same parts of our body, but they tell them to do two opposite things. So the sympathetic nervous system, as I said, controls all of our functions related to arousal. This is the part of the nervous system that takes over when our body is fighting for survival. So you have probably heard the sympathetic nervous system referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze system, or maybe just the fight or flight system. Fight refers to preparing to defend yourself. Flight refers to preparing to flee from an attack. And freezing is an automatic response that a lot of animals have. Think about like a deer freezing in the headlights in response to extreme fear. And humans do this too. The hopefully easy way of remembering what the parasympathetic nervous system does is that in contrast to fight or flight actions of the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of rest and digest functions. So when we're not anxious, when we're not aroused, when we're not in danger, the parasympathetic nervous system is what keeps our heart beating. It's what keeps our diaphragm moving and our lungs filling with oxygen. It controls our airways and our heart rate when those things are regular and slow. The sympathetic nervous system controls our heart rate when our heart is racing and when our airways are relaxed so that we can breathe in more and get more blood, oxygenated blood to our limbs to fight or flee. So sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest. And as you can imagine, when we talk about psychopathology, which is often related to strong negative emotions and arousal, we're often going to be talking about problems or just differences with the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, getting close to the end of the neuroanatomy part of this lecture, but the important thing to remember about this is that broadly, the brain has 3 anatomical divisions. And you can kind of think about these as layers on a cake, with the hindbrain being the bottom layer that developed first. It's the older structure evolutionarily. So in theory, every organism that exists that has a complicated brain evolved from a common ancestor that only had a nerve, their only nervous system was the hindbrain and spinal column. So the hindbrain basically helps to regulate the functions that are just keeping us alive. Autonomic functions related to breathing, keeping our hearts beating, keeping our digestive muscles moving. It also helps to relay sensory information coming in from the peripheral nervous system, from the somatic nervous system, to the midbrain and forebrain. The midbrain helps to regulate movement, so it takes that incoming sensory information, pairs it with outgoing motor control information, and basically tells us, like, okay, so you just put your right foot forward. We know where your right foot is in space, so now we move your left foot, knowing where your right foot is and how it just moved. It kind of helps keep us oriented in space, and it helps to smoothly integrate our sensory experience of the world with our conscious behaviors. The forebrain, though, is really the structure that we'll basically only be focusing on in this class. This is the more complicated structure in our brain. It's the structure that evolved the most recently, although of course that's not very recent because every mammal has a forebrain. Lizards and birds, of course, all have forebrains. So it's still a very evolutionarily old structure, but it's involved in complicated information processing. Humans use it for sentient functions like reasoning, thinking about the future, making plans. This is where our personality lives. This is where our ability to speak and comprehend language lives. And this is where our conscious brain perceives sensory information and where our conscious brain produces motor output. The limbic system is also part of the forebrain, and the limbic system is really involved. Well, it has many functions, but the most important function that we're going to be focusing on in this class relate to the amygdala, which helps to receive information from the outside world and help us produce an emotional response. The emotion that the amygdala is most closely associated with is fear. The hippocampus is very involved in the formation and consolidation of memories. So while the amygdala is taking in information from the environment and using it to formulate emotional responses, the hippocampus is taking in information from the environment, consolidating it, organizing it into structures throughout our forebrain where our memories are stored, and helping us activate the correct memories to understand what's going on around us. So there are obviously many psychological disorders that involve excessive experiences of negative emotion, especially fear. These disorders we can infer might be caused by problems with or individual differences in the functioning of the amygdala. Many of the disorders that we'll talk about also involve problems with memory, either difficulty properly consolidating a memory in the case of PTSD, or potentially difficulty activating and accessing memories appropriately in the case of depression. The hypothalamus and thalamus are involved respectively in maintaining homeostasis, so keeping track of our body's energy balance, when we last ate, when we last drank, when we last slept, and helping us to regulate our energy levels and keep our body going through conscious behavior. The thalamus is also called the sensory relay. So the sensory information that's coming into the midbrain, we don't perceive that consciously. And in fact, sensory information hits this part of the brain first, so that we can do things like if we're about to fall up the stairs, we can put our hands out really quickly. Our body coordinates that motor action before it reaches our conscious brain. So even though the somatic nervous system controls conscious movement, it also controls movements like that happen pre-consciously, that happen before our conscious awareness. So sensory information hits the midbrain first, and it's a little bit slower to get to the thalamus. It relays on the thalamus after it hits the midbrain. But the thalamus is the part of our brain that relays that sensory information to the other structures in our forebrain where we perceive it consciously. So sensory information in the midbrain influences our automatic motor behaviors without us consciously realizing it. Sensory information that hits the thalamus is relayed to the areas of our brain where we have a conscious experience. Okay, so the other relevant structure besides the limbic system in the forebrain is the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is the layer of neurons on the outside of our brain. It's like the sort of skin of our brain. The limbic system is within that, but it's still the forebrain. It's not a midbrain structure. Okay, so you may have heard in like biology or anatomy classes that we have kind of 4 lobes of the brain. The cerebellum is actually a hindbrain structure, but it has a cortex. So that's the 5th thing here. But the 4 lobes of our forebrain, our cerebral cortex, are the temporal lobe, which is right here behind our ears. This is really involved in primarily hearing, but also in recognition. So facial recognition, but also our ability to recognize patterns and familiar objects and identify things based on individual features. Our occipital lobe is in the back of the brain. This is the area that's most responsible for processing vision consciously. The parietal lobe is the middle part of our brain. It's kind of like between our 2 ears. This is the part of our brain that processes our conscious awareness of touch and taste, and also kinesthetic awareness, which is our awareness of where our body is in space. The areas on the parietal lobe, this is known as the somatosensory cortex. This is where this sensory information reaches our conscious awareness. The frontal cortex as a whole is involved in motor control. So telling our bodies consciously what actions to take, and also processing smell consciously. But the functions that are the most important for psychopathology relate to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain right behind our eyes, behind our forehead. This is the part of your brain where basically it's the part of your brain that makes you a human, because this is our self-knowledge, our ability to think about the future, our ability to think about the past and realize that we exist in the present. It's our ability to direct our attention and focus our attentional resources on things that we want to concentrate on. It's our ability to plan for the future. It's our ability to think through how to solve problems. The prefrontal cortex also plays a role in our ability to consciously regulate all of our other brain processes. So for example, if there's something that you're really stressed out and anxious about, that sort of emotion is being relayed up from the amygdala, but you have an exam to study for and you really can't think about it until tomorrow when your exam is over. Your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain where you're having that conscious thought, I don't want to think about this right now. I need to focus on something else. I'm going to take my mind off it and focus on my work. That is what your prefrontal cortex is doing. It's helping to regulate all of your other conscious experiences and allow you to work towards a conscious goal that you have. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about neurotransmitters. These are the important ones, the ones with little explosions next to them. But basically, like I already said, neurotransmitters are protein structures that allow for communication between neurons. You know what? I'm sorry. I'm saying that they're proteins. They are not proteins. They are molecules that have a shape that bind to receptor proteins. So I apologize for this. The receptor is what is a protein. So it has that protein structure. Neurotransmitters are molecules that fit into that protein structure. That's not super important, but this diagram reminded me that there's no amino acids in neurotransmitters. But a lot of neurotransmitters are the byproduct or the product of proteins being synthesized and broken down. So for example, as we'll talk about in the depression lectures a little bit, the molecule serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that's involved in regulating and balancing mood, is the breakdown product of a protein called tryptophan, which is found in foods like turkey and beans. So we need to have dietary sources of tryptophan in order for our bodies to produce serotonin. It's produced from breaking down this protein that we eat in our food, but it's not a protein itself. So in addition to neurotransmitters, which are molecules produced in the brain that allow for neuronal communication, our bodies also produce hormones, which serve the same function as neurotransmitters and can communicate with nerves in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but that originate in organs other than the central nervous system. So the main example of this that's going to be relevant for this class is cortisol, which you've probably heard referred to as the stress hormone. It's produced in the pituitary gland, which is, it sits above the kidneys, but one of the main functions that cortisol has is to find its way into the brain and communicate with receptors there to help control our body's physiological response to stress. So each neuron has corresponding receptors that our neurons produce. The neurotransmitter fits into that receptor like a lock fits a key. As I also mentioned, we can synthesize fake neurotransmitters that also interact with receptor proteins. They also occur naturally in foods and substances. So when we intentionally produce or use an exogenous molecule that interacts with a receptor to enhance the effect that the naturally produced neurotransmitter would have, we call that an agonist. So an agonist is a drug that interacts with a receptor to either do the same action as a neurotransmitter or to enhance the activity of the neurotransmitters that our body naturally produces. A pretty common example of an agonist is, as I mentioned earlier, alcohol. Ethanol is an agonist for the GABA receptor. So alcohol kind of does the same thing in our brain that our naturally produced GABA does. An antagonist is any drug that works to decrease or block the effect of a neurotransmitter. Trying to think of a good example of an antagonist. Well, as we'll talk about in the psychosis lecture, antipsychotics are antagonists of certain types of dopamine receptors. So they help basically to kind of quiet down the excitatory actions that dopamine has in some brain regions that can lead to psychotic symptoms. Okay, so that was a lot. This link here will take you to an interactive neuroanatomy study guide, but I don't want you to focus on this or worry about it too much. Whenever we talk about a brain structure or a neurotransmitter being relevant, I'll reintroduce it and try to situate it in this model of the brain that I hope this lecture gave you. So really, this is just kind of supposed to be a very basic primer. My only goal is that if you haven't heard of these terms before, they'll be kind of familiar when they come up again in the context of specific symptom disorders. Okay, so the last topic in this kind of very fast introduction to psychological science is a concept known as Darwinian medicine. So basically the question that Darwinian medicine asks is, given that our bodies evolved in response to selection pressures that helped our ancestors to survive, why are our bodies designed in ways that make us vulnerable to illness? So as the reading for this class kind of emphasized, we're not intentionally designed by evolution. Evolution is kind of a random process. So a lot of random accidents happen. And that is one explanation for how diseases, including psychopathology, can come about. But there are also explanations that are a little bit more systematic and that don't kind of just rely on chance, and that can actually give us some insight into why we have the psychological experiences that we have. So disease in general, but psychopathology in this example, can be a product of organisms existing in environments that are different than the environment that shaped their evolution. It can be a product of actually evolved and adaptive defenses that our body has developed to help protect us against predators, against danger from the environment, or against disease and pathogens. It can be a product of constraints. So there are just some things that the human body physically can't do, that the human brain physically maybe can't process, because we're flesh and blood biological machines. There are also evolutionary trade-offs where potentially a negative or dangerous trait is preserved because it's associated with a positive benefit for our species survival. So I'm going to just briefly go through each of these again and give some examples from non-psychological medicine, and then maybe briefly introduce some psychological examples towards the end as like a little bit of an appetizer for the rest of the semester, where these concepts will keep coming up. Okay, so one of kind of the biggest Darwinian medicine theories in psychiatry and psychology has to do with psychopathology being a response to humans living in an environment that's very different from the one that we evolved in. So what is known as the environment of evolutionary adaptation is basically just the context in which most of our species evolution happened. And for humans or hominids, that evolution happened in hunter-gatherer societies that lived probably semi-nomadic lifestyles in small groups of 20 to 100 people, usually with some kind of family-based network keeping that 100 people together. Our ancestors lived in nuclear families, so parents and children stayed together. And our ancestors lived in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a picture of people from the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. They are one of the last modern hunter-gatherer societies. So evolutionary psychologists study their culture. They study their responses to situations that are analogous to situations that people living in other environments, people living other lifestyles might experience, to kind of see how people who are living a lifestyle that's pretty close to the one that we evolved in might react. Basically, the idea is that if the Hadza have a psychological experience or a certain reaction to stimuli, that probably means that that is a universal adaptation that all humans have, because they're living this lifestyle that's really close to our evolutionary environment. And at least until the 70s, they weren't exposed to a lot of influences from outside society. The important thing to remember about the Hadza and other people who are living lifestyles that are somewhat closer to the lifestyle that we lived in our environment of evolutionary adaptation is that when we work with them and study the way that they think, we're not studying ancestral humans, we're studying modern humans whose brains are just as evolved as every other modern human society. So it's not like the Hadza can give us a snapshot of what actual ancestral hominid hunter-gatherers were like. They are modern humans, but their lifestyle is really similar to the lifestyle that our hunter-gatherer hominid ancestors lived. So when we think about the environment of evolutionary adaptation, we also have to think about what selection pressures existed in that environment. These are forces that organisms, in this case hominids living in that environment, encountered in their lives and that were relevant to their ability to reproduce and pass on their genes. Because of course, in evolution, organisms that don't survive long enough to pass on their genes don't have any influence at all on modern humans, because those genes died with that organism. So any behavior we have, any genetically mediated trait that we have, comes from an ancestor who survived and reproduced and passed their traits on to their children, and in turn had their children survive. That is also known as reproductive fitness, the ability to pass on your genes through having children and keeping them alive long enough for those children to reproduce. So the important concept here basically is that all humans evolved in the same environment, but most modern humans are living in environments that are really different from the one that we evolved in. So how does this relate to psychopathology? Well, one way it could relate is that certain types of thoughts, feelings, or behavior that actually helped our ancestors to survive in the environment of evolutionary adaptation might be kind of detrimental in our modern lives. Another way of thinking about it is that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that cause suffering and psychological pain in modern humans may have caused the same kind of suffering and psychological pain in our ancestors, but didn't prevent them from reproducing. So again, evolution isn't trying to create a perfect organism or create an organism that doesn't suffer. It's trying to create an organism that reproduces. So if traits that we experience today as negative didn't prevent our ancestors from reproducing and didn't cause them to be outcompeted by others who didn't have those traits, then regardless of how unhappy they make us today, they would not have been selected against in our environment of evolutionary adaptation. So another model of where diseases come from is that diseases arise as a defense against pathogens or a defense against dangers in the environment. So one example of this is fevers. Fever is a symptom of infection, and it's a natural reaction that our body has to make our body temperature too hot for viruses or bacteria to reproduce. So having a fever is experienced as really uncomfortable and unpleasant, but it's actually our body's way of killing off an invading pathogen and saving our lives. Another example of a disease or a symptom as a defense, and also against pathogens, is morning sickness. So when someone is pregnant, their immune system is relatively suppressed so that their immune system doesn't attack the developing fetus. But because the pregnant person's immune system is suppressed, it makes them extra vulnerable to getting a foodborne illness, or really any illness. But humans are very vulnerable to foodborne illness because, as we'll talk about in the eating disorder lectures, we are omnivores. We have a very flexible and varied diet, but it also opens up lots of opportunities for us to ingest foods that are spoiled or dangerous or that might be contaminated. So people who have morning sickness are less likely to eat strongly flavored or protein-based foods, the same kinds of foods that are more likely to carry external toxins that could make you sick. And importantly, in addition to making the pregnant person sick, these toxins could have a really negative impact on the development of the fetus during about the first 18 weeks of fetal development. And it just so happens that the first 18 weeks of development, when the fetus is most vulnerable to external toxins, is when morning sickness tends to be worse. And we actually have some evidence that morning sickness was selected for because it increases people's reproductive fitness, because women who have more morning sickness are more likely, or sorry, women who have morning sickness are less likely to have early miscarriages than women who don't. And actually, this has even been found to be more true in cultures and societies where they eat a lot of meat, because meat is a major source of foodborne illness. So people who evolved, or not who evolved, but who adapted in environments where they were eating a lot of meat, for them, the tendency to have morning sickness was an even stronger influence on reproductive fitness. So it's even more common in people with those genetic backgrounds. Okay, so some diseases or problems that we have as humans might arise from constraints on our evolution. And an example of this is human childbirth, the human pelvis, and the size of babies' heads when they're born. So compared to most other mammals, human mothers and babies are very much more likely to die in childbirth. And this is almost entirely because of the reproductive anatomy that bipedal human females have. Basically, bipedalism means that there's just not as much room inside our abdominal cavity for a fetus to develop. So the position that it has to develop in means that in order for it to be born, it has to actually rotate and flip around before birth. That causes problems. Sometimes it doesn't happen. That's known as a breech birth. Even when it does happen, there are cases where the infant's head is just too big to fit through the pelvic opening, and that results in death during childbirth. So why do humans have such dangerous childbirth? Well, it's because we're smart and we have really big brains. There's just a lot of neural mass in our brains relative to the size of our bodies. So for human babies to be born with these large, intelligent brains, they have to be born with big heads, but those big heads have to be able to fit through the birth canal. So this is a constant kind of constraint on the size of humans' heads. Intelligence and consciousness and sentience is a very beneficial trait to humans. It obviously has really enhanced our survival as a species, but there might be a limit on how smart we can get that's based on how big a head can fit through a birth canal. This constraint is also the reason why human babies are born relatively undeveloped compared to other mammals. Whereas when a horse is born, it can walk right away. Human infants can't walk for the first 9 to 12 months of their lives. There's still a lot of development that needs to happen outside of the mother's body, because if it were to happen while the fetus was still inside her body, the fetus's head would get too big to pass through the birth canal. So another category of evolutionary influences on the ability to have disease has to do with trade-offs. And one of the most famous examples of this is the sickle cell trait. So the sickle cell trait is a genetic mutation that when you have one copy of this gene, when only one of your parents gave you this gene and the other parent gave you a normal corresponding gene, you produce hemoglobin that is not a conducive environment for malaria to reproduce in. If you have two copies of the sickle cell trait gene, you produce hemoglobin that is deformed into the shape of a cross, or not a cross, sorry, a sickle, a little crescent moon. And these this causes anemia. It prevents those cells from being as effective in carrying oxygen, and it can create really painful blood clots and cause death by strokes. So one copy of this gene protects you against malaria, but two copies definitely in our ancestral environment would have decreased reproductive fitness, because it typically, it either causes people to be in debilitating pain or often to die young. But as you can see from this map, the sickle cell trait is most highly prevalent in human populations where malaria is common. So humans evolved alongside the mosquitoes that carry malaria. Malaria will kill you too. So humans evolved the ability to carry the sickle cell trait, which helps to protect against malaria and increases the reproductive fitness of people who have one copy, even though having two copies significantly decreases the reproductive fitness of people who have it. Another possible example of a trade-off could be, as you read about in the reading, testicles. Sperm, in order for them to be viable, need to be a little bit cooler than body temperature. So the trade-off that humans have developed is the sperm are carried in these very vulnerable, delicate sacs outside the body. External testes are vulnerable, but sperm have to be kept at this temperature. So that's another example of an evolutionary trade-off. And very broadly, all psychopathology is an example of a trade-off, because if humans didn't have intelligence and consciousness, arguably we would be without a lot of the symptoms of psychopathology that cause distress. So as I mentioned before, our intelligence and problem-solving abilities are the reason why we're so successful as a species, but it comes with the cost of our also having the ability to psychologically and existentially suffer. Okay, so the last Darwinian evolutionary argument for where psychological disease comes from is that not every single trait was shaped by selective reproductive pressure. Traits that were shaped by selective pressure, traits that helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce, are known as adaptations. These are genes that benefit an individual and a species' survival. There are certain traits that are just sort of natural byproducts of adaptations. So one example is that our blood is red, not because there's any survival benefit to our blood being red, but because when exposed to light, the cells that carry oxygen react and turn red. So blood being red isn't critical to our survival as a species, but blood cells being able to carry oxygen is, and as a byproduct of that, our blood is red. Another type of byproduct is genetic linkage, where two genes that are close together on a chromosome are more likely to be passed on together than genes that are further apart. During the process of meiosis, I think it's mitosis. I'll get it right in class. But during the process of our cells coming together to swap genes and then break apart to produce new half chromosomes that we pass along to our children in our reproductive cells, our eggs or sperm. During that process, genes that are closer together on the chromosome are more likely to be passed on together. So one explanation for why psychopathology persists is that maybe some genes that confer risk for psychopathology are just very close to other genes that confer some kind of benefit to reproduction and survival. So they tend to be inherited together. An important concept when it comes to thinking about the genetic contribution to mental health and mental illness is equifinality and multifinality. And basically, these two terms together are just taken to mean there's no single gene for any psychopathology. There's no gene for anxiety. There's no gene for schizophrenia. There's no gene for depression. There's no gene for autism. Instead, there's hundreds and maybe thousands of genes that increase or decrease our risk of getting these very complicated conditions. So because of that, the same disorder, the same presenting symptoms, could have very different combinations of genetic causes. At the same time, it's true that individuals with similar genetic risk factors could have different symptom outcomes because of the interactions of those genes with the environment or with other genes. So because there's no single gene for psychopathology, there are important environmental influences and random combinations of genes that can affect an individual's risk for psychopathology. In addition to genetic linkage, the equifinality and multifinality of the cause of psychopathology. There are also accidents. So during that process of cell division, sometimes when our genes are being copied by RNA to create new genes, new copies of those genes, the RNA just makes a mistake and it switches a letter or a base pair. So the gene that was copied is different than the gene that was passed on. Sometimes these mutations are so severe that they're incompatible with life, but sometimes they're minor enough that they alter functioning, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but allow the organism to survive with that genetic mutation. And we do know that these random, what's known as de novo mutations, because they originate for the first time in the person who passes on that sperm or egg cell, they can affect functioning and they can contribute to that that equifinality where many combinations of genes come together to cause mental illness. And then the last type of accident or error that can contribute to mental illness is viral exposure. So for some people who are already vulnerable because of their genetic risk factors or because of environmental factors during their development, exposure to some viruses can trigger new disease processes. So a non-psychological example of this is long COVID. There are some people for whom having a COVID infection triggers problems with the autonomic nervous system that causes a syndrome called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where basically the autonomic nervous system has a hard time regulating heart rate and blood pressure when people change positions suddenly. And basically it can lead to passing out when you stand up. So COVID doesn't cause that for everyone, but for some people, the coronavirus changes something in the cells that triggers this disease process in the body, affecting the autonomic nervous system. Other examples of virus exposure triggering psychopathology include schizophrenia and OCD symptoms and eating disorder symptoms caused by a syndrome called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder. Okay, that was a lot. This is all just kind of a preview of themes that are going to come up throughout the semester. So there's really no need to worry too much about memorizing this. We're going to revisit all of these disorders and talk about what evolutionary pressures might have come together to give humans the capacity to have these disorders. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this is because as a therapist, as someone who treats people with these disorders, it can be very validating for people to hear okay, you're anxious, but that's because that anxiety helped your ancestor at some time. That anxiety is the reason why you're here today. Without that anxiety, your ancestor wouldn't have survived to pass on those genes to you that allow you to be alive, to be the person that you are. That can be validating for people because really anxiety, depression, OCD and its related disorders, and restrictive eating disorders are all kind of examples of too much of a good thing. These are behaviors that helped our ancestors to survive. Some people just have higher levels of those behaviors, and that can cause problems in the modern world. Disorders of environmental mismatch include things like obesity. We evolved as hunter-gatherers in environments where food was scarce. So it was very adaptive for our ancestors to be very drawn to high-calorie foods and to eat as much as they could when those foods were available. So naturally, modern humans living in environments where those foods are readily available aren't naturally good at regulating their eating around those foods. Same with substance use. We didn't evolve around highly refined substances that trigger the same neural pathways as natural reinforcers. Examples of disorders that might be related to trade-offs. Many of the traits that are related to autism at lower levels are really beneficial. Same with schizophrenia and same with antisocial personality disorder. In fact, in a population where only 1% of people have antisocial personality disorder, being a psychopath is actually very beneficial to the person who has that trait. Even though in populations where there's a lot of people with that trait, it stops being beneficial. We're also going to talk about disorders that are a product of basically just the constraints of our nervous system. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that all humans are vulnerable to, just to varying degrees. For every person, there's some threshold of trauma where they would develop post-traumatic stress disorder because there's a limit to what the brain can take. Similarly to attachment disorders, we need to have the ability to attach and form relationships. And so when we don't have that, our brains don't develop properly, and it leads to attachment disorders. And then lastly, there are some disorders, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that are triggered or caused by accidents and mutations. We know that there are lots of genetic mutations, including de novo mutations, that contribute to risk for autism. And really interestingly, viral exposure during fetal development is a risk factor for schizophrenia, whereas viral exposure during childhood is a risk factor for OCD and eating disorders, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome. Okay, so some takeaways from this lecture. The basic premise of psychological science is that we can learn about human behavior, thoughts, and emotion using the scientific method, observation and experimentation. Behaviors and emotional responses can be learned through repeated associations with salient stimuli or through reinforcement from the environment, either reward or punishment for behavior. That is the scientific evidence-based theory of behaviorism. It's also true that behavior, thoughts, and feelings have a biological basis. They physically exist within our brain and nervous system. Our conscious experiences are mediated by neurochemical processes. We can understand a lot about why humans as a species have the capacity for certain behaviors, thoughts, and emotions, why it's possible for us to have psychopathology by considering how those behaviors, thoughts, and emotions might have been adaptive, might have been shaped by reproductive success in our evolutionary environment. But as we'll talk about next time, all that Darwinian psychiatry really explains is why we have the capacity for psychopathology. It doesn't help to explain why some individuals have more risk than others, or necessarily where individual disorders come from. So that's what we'll focus more on in the next lecture and throughout this class. And these are just some more figures that might help you picture operant conditioning and learn the terminology.